Okay, thank you guys, and I'm sorry. That, by the way, it's radio micro.
Yeah, I'm just not sure what it's actually doing, but I was the fact that the Carlo has to go along and talk about it and hear the see. I'll see if here.
Try all the one
It does always happen, especially because we are giving everyone the possibility to join in that way. Means that you have to manage your own connection. Okay, so can I make you host and you can control the situation? Okay. So we start now that we are sharing this presentation, and the first part of the presentation is actually exactly like what we said. Please, because we're a small society, we give everyone the possibility to join in and unmute your microphone, which means that when you're not using your microphone, please actually put it on mute so that you disturb the session. And if you wish to join the society, this is the website. We are happy to allow new membership. The first panel, the first panelist, it's Aidan. Aidan, the floor is yours.
Okay, I just can see it from here, yeah?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Okay, thanks, folks. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about a system that we introduced in ESB a number of years ago, built by a company in the UK. It's called Opera Log. It's basically the operations log, but a key part of the operations log is a handover log, which is a subset of that. So hopefully the slides will maybe explain a little bit more about I suppose how we do shift handover and how we've tried to formalize it over the years, because I suppose one of the key things about the handover is to make sure that it really happens, that the critical pieces of information are actually handed over, and that it's not just a chat, you know, that people will want to have that social interaction, but they then have to convey key pieces of information and filter out a lot of other stuff that doesn't need to be. So I think Chiara was around in ESB at the time and involved in the rollout of this system. Oh, sorry, down, yeah. Okay, yeah. So before we introduced this system, there were various systems in use in ESB, everything from, believe it or not, paper-based log books in the older stations to Word documents that were just duplicated every shift, you know, template duplicated, and then the new stuff entered. Very difficult to search and to scan to find the relevant pieces of information. So when we introduced this system, it was quite a change. For one thing, all of the members on the team could enter stuff into this. Their name was attached to it. Their login details meant that, you know, it was recorded that who entered it and when they entered it. So when you go in, you just see these list of logs: night shift, day shift, night shift, day shift, which, you know, it looks a little daunting there, but you can easily search through all of those much easier than searching through effectively possibly thousands of Word documents, 700 documents a year, effectively 2 a day. So this was a huge change for us. So probably easier actually if I stand up and I can see it here. So there's lots of stuff here. This is just one day. This is out of the training manual that I just pulled the screenshot. There's lots of stuff here. Most of it is not going to be required for handover. I guess while you're in here, you have the ability to just, when something critical happens, you can share that to what we call the handover log. And what happens when you do that is you see this little green, the green dots there. They indicate things that are shared out into the handover log. There are also the little arrow up in the top shows that's something which we're conveying to all of the shifts on every shift handover over a prolonged period of time. Maybe something major has changed and it needs to be communicated for, you know, something is going to be out of operation for the next 2 months, or we need to do something different for the next 3 weeks or whatever. So that just indicates what key pieces of information are taken out of the kind of I mean, literally almost minute by minute events that are being recorded here. I mean, this system has a lot of functionality in it. It has the ability to take in alarm signals from the plant about critical safety alarms, and it just populates the log automatically. So the guy doesn't have to write down such and such an alarm happened. It's already in there. They can't forget it. It's conveyed to everyone. Then he or she can decide whether to share that onward if it's really critical, or if it's just something they're going to deal with and it's going to be done with by the end of the day. So what the whole thing, if you like, filters down is at the shift change, there's a much abbreviated little log here. It's called the morning meeting, and this entity just used it as a morning meeting. We operate on a 24-hour basis, so it's a shift change meeting that happens twice a day. So the key pieces of information are summarized up here, just 5 points. Everything is divided into categories so that you can meet. It's not a chronological order, which when you think about it, the guy that's coming in doesn't really need to know the minute by minute detail, but they do need to know what the big safety items are, the big environmental items are, and the general information is the general operating stuff, the commercial stuff, like what we're generating, what we're going to be generating, and availability stuff like that. So I guess it's really good for doing lots of things like that. I suppose one of the challenges, which I know that's on one of the questions, is to make sure that you don't flood the place with a lot of stuff that's unnecessary. You know, this, when you put in something that's recurring to remind the shift change day after day after day, you need someone to remember to take that away later on. It sounds obvious, but people are very reluctant to remove the thing that's there as a note to everyone. But if you don't, you'll just basically overload people with too much information, and then they'll miss the important stuff. So
we let
yeah,
because we're going to go back to
Yeah.
this.
But maybe just before you finish it,
Yeah.
will you give us context? So
Yeah,
who uses this?
yeah.
How many people and how many shift handovers happen? Or
Yeah,
with how
there
many
are,
people?
yes, I should explain. It depends location to location. Where I was, it was 2 shifts a day, 12-hour shifts, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Other stations have an 8-hour shift. So there can be 2 or 3 shifts a day. All of the stations have, you know, they have an ongoing operations. So you need to hand over a distilled piece of information to the people who are coming on to operate a generating station for the next shift. Largely, there would be 2 or 3 people in each station using it all the time. That could be 2 people by 3 shifts, so that's 6 people. So if you like, when you multiply it up and you add in the people who are off on the day and people who are on leave and people who are on training, there are typically 10 to 15 people in the station, but only 2 or 3 of them in at any one time. So now lots of other people use this as well, but usually in read mode. The maintenance staff that come in the morning will look at this. They don't add anything to it, but they will use that to gather information about, you know, what happened overnight and what they might need to do. And stuff can be shared to them as well by creating a logbook for the maintenance team, if that's what you want to do. Or there might be, you know, a management log where you just want to pass certain pieces of information to certain people. And all that does is it provides a link to the other person to get access to the specific point. There is only one record of the truth. The log is the record. It can't be edited once the shift is finished. So that's quite important. You know, it's kind of locked. That was what was written down at the time. If it's wrong, it's wrong. We can note it afterwards. But the people who are being shared that information are not getting a copy of it. They're just getting a link to the actual record itself. So, that's,
Thank
that
you.
explains.
Yes.
The link swallow with some of the things that Laurence might say about what is known at the time.
Yeah.
Brilliant,
Okay.
thank you.
So, all right.
Okay. Okay, so one of the biggest challenges that we face as a fire service, and certainly as an individual turning up at an incident, is the decision making. There's so much going on that it's hard to capture everything. Okay, so the whole idea is to try and develop a structured approach for an officer who arrives in the fire scene with only one. He only has one vehicle with him. He's 5 members of personnel with him. And he has to make a decision, what do I do first? What do I do next? And how am I going to achieve this? So I developed this proprietary tool I'm going to show you that I developed in 2012, a dynamic tool to assist in those decisions that have to be made very, very quickly, but to be able to do it in a way that's going to say, I have made a decision and I have made a safe decision based on the information that I have, and capturing that information at the time. But in hindsight, everybody has the beauty and the benefit to criticize the decision that went wrong. But unfortunately, that comfort is not available to the person who arrives on the disaster scene. So what I've done then is frame this tool underpins a lot of what goes on and assists somebody to stay in control and make good informed decisions. And what I've done then is I've sort of modified my talk a little bit to sort of say how it can be helpful in a handover. So this here is the StratTag tool. Okay. So en route, I get a call to say, right, the fire at such a place, and persons reported or not reported, and I'm looking at environment, people. Okay, how many people are going to be involved? Is it a domestic structure? Is it a commercial structure? Is it a home care structure? Places. So rather than going through all of these individuals, because it takes a while to go through this, I just have these different categories for making decisions as we're going along. What happens on arrival? Where I'm going to position myself? What message am I going to give? Because it's very, very important that the first arriving officer retail has an idea. What else am I going to need here? You've got to get your support and your reinforcement rolling as soon as possible. And at the same time, you also have to be conscious of the fact that you can't be wasting resources, because our resources are finite. So you can't be rolling resources to an incident, where they're not going to be required or where they're going to be turned back, as soon as they arrive. That's defeats the purpose of having in a state of readiness. So also say the risks. When I make a decision what I'm going to do, who's going to be at risk, what control measures, and I'm using the hierarchy of control here. What control measures can I put in place to make an action as safe as possible? I use this sort of a mnemonic SPOC rules, span of control, SPOC span of control. I have to have a rapid intervention team. What utilities am I going to need? The likes of the gas, water, electricity. Law enforcement, is it a kind of environment whereby I'm going to have crowd control issues? EMS, so emergency medical services, we would always, larger incident, we have one of our own ambulances on standby for our own crews, and then obviously for any of the public that's affected, and then obviously a safety officer. My tactical objects, then the first thing I could do is I'm going to sectorize and then consider what life is at risk, preventing de-escalation, extinguishing the fire and resolve. These are our tactical objects. I'm talking about a fire situation specifically here, of course. The benchmarks, how do I know that I've reached any of these? So incident stabilization, the fire starts spreading, life is all property has been damage is being limited, fire under control, and then resolution. The resources that I need as I need them. And then again, another mnemonic that I have here is think, plan, implement. What's the system of work? Review, evaluate, and revise. And then always that's underpinned by is the risk, that the benefit outweighs the risk. If I'm going to send 2 people into a fire, are they going to achieve something? Is there going to be a benefit to that, or is the risk too great? Is the fire developed to save people lives? I'm not going to commit more lives to a potentially fatal situation. This here is the task. These are the critical tasks that must be carried out. On the first, this is a fire situation again. I need to secure water. I need to have a command support officer. So a command support officer is somebody who works with me, and I say what I'm doing and he's documenting it. So it's capturing information at a time. Like I say, you cannot, capture that information, because you could make a decision or say, to somebody, don't go in there. It's not documented. Someone goes in there and they're in front of the man with the grey wig, and he says, guess what? You sent him in. I didn't prove it. So again, it's about, protecting all individuals at a scene like that. So I have to have a pump operator. I have to have a crew that's going to the fire. That's 2 people. So look, we have 2 people making down water, 1 person making down is command support officer, 1 person operating the pump, and 2 people going to the fire. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. Okay, I only have 5. Okay, so just think about in your initial arrival, all that stuff that has to be done. I also have to have somebody in BA. Now, most likely they could be the same people. I also have to have an entry control officer. I can't send someone into a fire without an entry control officer to document what they're doing and where they're going. And then I have to have a rescue team. Or I could have a different team going to do a rescue. So I have somebody who's fighting the fire, and then I have someone who's specifically tasked for going to, and that again will be a team of 2. I have to have a backup line made down because first aid's made down straight away, and we have to have a backup line then if it goes belly up. So I could go through that a bit more with you, but
No, that's it.
that's sort of to capture everything. So this is all the decisions are being made, and the idea is that everything is captured, that your decisions are made, you know, in an informed fashion, and you can justify the actions that you've taken. Right, is that not really? And this here is a command board, and it actually has details, everything that's going on, but that's with the second, third, or maybe even 4th arriving truck that you get that set up. Okay, and that's all done with a Chinograph erasable pen, and it doesn't capture the information adequately as far as I'm concerned. It's what we use at the moment, and it works, and it goes back donkey's years, like, I mean, but it works, but the problem is it doesn't capture all the information as effectively as it could, and then there is the risk that someone could rub out something that's pertinent and needed as evidence later on.
And it's because you use that to communicate between the ship, someone taking over.
So
from
that would be the board that we would say, that's what we use at the moment to say, this is what is happening at the moment. My argument is that using the likes of the StratTag tool, which is underpinned with the use of a phone or a tablet with an app on it, where it's push button. As a question arises, you're populated with your possible answers. You tap it, and everything is captured instantaneously, then fed back, because memory is lost very, very quickly at these incidents. And then you have all the information, and it provides for very good reporting and very accurate reporting. So just to summarize very quickly, decision making under the process, under duress, that's why I came up with the StratTag tool. It is a structured approach. It captures everything and then prompts you with the use of the app. It prompts the officer in charge what I should be doing next. Have I considered everything? And then it also determines his decision-making process. Strategy and tactics tool then determining what's my benchmarks, what are my objectives here. Decision-making for the first response. So it is generally most useful for first responders, but the information is all captured. And then with the evolving technology that we have, that an instant control unit can arrive and then tap into the information that's been captured on the app, and then has an instantaneous, view of what's going on. Dynamic risk assessment is underpins the whole as well, because as things change, your risk assessment change. If you put a plan in place, it doesn't work out, you have to step back, reevaluate, make another plan, and then implement it. And then, as I said, it's very helpful in instant handover if we captured all that data in real time, as it happens, and then it's the instant command unit can tap in and then see all what's going on. Okay, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laurence. And have you piloted it or?
I've used it for 6 years, and I found it very, very useful, and particularly and my main objective was in the production of accurate reporting, and demonstrating then also the value of the intervention of the fire service when it arrives, because we can make an evaluation on how much the property is worth, and if we hadn't arrived, how much would be lost, and then make it versus how much was saved. All right. So if there's a lot of uses for it, it hasn't got the because we're very, very entrenched in our instant command system, and it requires sort of a little bit of innovation and to take it on. But so has it been piloted to its full potential? No, it's been piloted from the perspective of first arriving officer, and I've a couple of case studies demonstrating its use and how it's successful use.
Great. Okay, thank you. Cora,
we'll do the transfer first. So there are 2 slides. We decided to give you an overview of what is done in another sector, which is airport operation, ground operation in airports. Just to let you know, 6 years ago, in many airports, in most airports, shift handovers between, airports are 24 hours, so shifts are similar format, 2 or 3, was done often on paper or on boards, especially in small regional airports. So this is the example of what happened in a small regional airport where a conventional shift handover was digitalized in an electronic shift handover. And similar to what happened with Opera Log, and it's around the same time as it was happening in ESP, this was happening in transport. So to have a more reliable form of communication that could be searched over time and that could be more accurate and a sort of avoiding misunderstanding. Before it was a board where tasks were potentially also deleted and you don't know whether they were done, you cannot search over time, etc. So this is an example of the shift handover as it happens now. It's related to arrival and departure and therefore the ground operation are associated with them, but the extra task that the shift manager can assign to different shifts so that they know whether they have to go look for baggage that been lost, inspection of airside or different areas of the airports, and the possibility of recording anomalies as they happen. So operational anomalies, as you were saying. So things that, even related to maintenance of equipment that fails and needs to be fixed. All of this is in one repository taken care of. And also over time, you can monitor the amount of tasks that are associated with different shifts and the amount of anomalies or issues that can come up associated with the workload of the different shifts. So that's very, very, very quickly. That's the overview. Now,
And Chiara, no, just a bit of context then, say who would use this or how many times a
So-
day or how many staff?
yeah, so 3 shifts, and it's used by the ground handlers. And then there are the operations, the check-in operators. So there are shifts in different areas because it's a regional airport. They manage the ground handling operation together with the check-in operations and the airport infrastructure. So even the maintenance and the runway inspections and all the area, the issue related to airside and landside of. So there are 3 shifts, and the operation manager is in charge of all of them. So therefore, the communication is from 3 different shifts.
And is this on an iPhone or on an
It's
iPad?
on a computer, an iPad, or an iPhone. So it's an electronic format that is portable and accessible from all these different formats.
Super, thank you.
Cora.
Cora, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, I'm getting some more help with this number here, is it? Yes, okay, great, thank you. Apologies for my voice. My presentation is a little bit more macroeconomics, designing in terms of designing structures and processes to improve conditions for people delivering services and people receiving them and the performance of the organization. And within that notion of macroeconomics, audit to check that has been done. So in healthcare audit, we give assurance to the organization around governance, risk management and control in relation to key risk issues. And one of the key risk issues that came onto our plan for 2022 was in relation to clinical handover. And that was all our risks are informed by information from 6 or 7 sources. It will be incident data, complaint data, causes of harm identified in the HC's patient safety strategy, which is from 2019 to 2024, and other, but for the clinical handover audit, that's where the information came to prompt us to do the audit of clinical handover. So in, for example, the HC investigation and the HICWA investigation of the death of Savita Halapanavar, there was a very specific issue identified linked to recommendation 5, which showed that the junior doctor had called a senior doctor in relation to the patient. They recalled that they conveyed information about the patient's blood pressure, heart rate, and temperature. But the senior doctor in the investigation said that they only recalled that they received information about the patient's temperature. So you can read this, it's on page 67 of the report. And asked whether the senior doctor would have given different advice if they'd got the other information about the other parameters. The senior doctor said, yes, I think I may have made or given different advice. And so recommendation 5 was connected directly to that experience of communication of patient critical information in a challenging environment across the phone, and talked about the need to use tools such as the SCAR tool or the ISPAR tool, which was already being used in acute services in Ireland. And so the report refers to that and says this needs to be extended out to maternity services. So the ISPAR tool was a tool that required I, identification, S, situation, B, background, A, assessment, and or recommendation. So it was about making sure there was structured communication about critical clinical information between the stakeholders. So that was an example of incident information that had told us that this was a risk we needed to be looking at in terms of audit. And then the second key piece of information was patient safety strategy, which says very clearly there are 13 key issues that need to be addressed to drive safety and improvement and performance of the HSE. And one of them is safety at boundaries, especially in relation to clinical information and handover. So those were the things that prompted this to go onto the audit plan for us. And you know, as the next speaker is going to say, handover in healthcare a little bit, I think, differently to the domains we've heard from already, is not just about at shift. It's also between departments, between parts of the organisation, and at times when a patient is clinically deteriorating, which was the case in the Alabama investigation. So there are 2 guidelines for the HSE, National Clinical Guideline number 5 and number 11. National Clinical Guideline number 5 was published in 2014 and has got to do with clinical handover in maternity services. And National Clinical Guideline number 11 was published in 2015 and it's got to do with clinical handover in acute services and children's services. And they would have had expert input from a human factors point of view. One of our Irish Economics and Human Factors Society committee members, Dr. Eva, or Professor Eva Doherty, who I think is on the call, contributed, gave input into these. So we did 2 audits. And as I say, it was looking at between shifts, between site and deteriorating patient. So one audit was related to maternity services and encompassed 2 sites. The other was related to acute services and did 2, maternity was 4, depending on the guideline. And just to say, again, Eva was involved in contributing to a training manual around shift handover, which focused on communications, leadership, and SBAR communications. So the objective of our audit then were every one of our audits, no matter what key risk is, be it clinical handover or whatever else, looks at, because we were giving assurance around governance, risk management and control, our audits will have objectives around what are the governance structures and processes in place around clinical handover. What is it recognised as a risk on the risk register, and is there evidence that it's been managed accordingly? Is there education and training being provided to support the implementation of the standard? Are there local audits ongoing? Our evidence is that, or our experience is, when local audits are ongoing, our national audits or our healthcare audits find a better performance. And is FBAR, so we had those 3. There are standard objectives for every single audit we do, and then we focus on some technical aspect of the audit based on the risk issue. So we looked at whether SBAR 3 or SBAR regular was being used. The guidelines say that SBAR 3 should be used for deteriorating patients, or SBAR should be used with deteriorating patients, and SBAR 3 should be used for handover between multidisciplinary teams. The 3 there, I explained SBAR already, but the additional R's in this scenario are read back and risk. So our findings were that for the 4 maternity sites, they had a satisfactory assurance level. So that my time is
No,
1 more minute. Okay. For the 4 maternity sites, when the auditors collected all of the information, and they'll have collected several hundred pieces of information from each individual sites in relation to that, they'd have put together their findings in relation to the governance, the risk management, the training, the local audit, and the actual technical aspects. They would have randomly selected relevant charts, and they'd have gone through them to see evidence that SBAR happened in clinical handover. When they put all of that together for the maternity sites, they scored well. Our assurance levels have 4 levels: satisfactory, reasonable, limited, and unsatisfactory. So you can see that the maternity sites fared well, the acute sites less so, and the acute sites, all of them had good governance, evidence of good governance arrangements. One of the acute sites hadn't adopted or hadn't got a local policy, procedure or guideline that was in line with the national standard. These sites fell down on not showing evidence in the healthcare records of use of ISPAR or ISPAR 3 in handovers, not having local clinical audit. And so that was the difference between the acute sites and the national sites. Just to say, when we do these audits, so this was one audit related to maternity services at 4 sites, one audit related to acute services at 2 sites. The information is aggregated. Each site gets their report, they get the recommendation, they sign off to say that they've accepted it and they've got a time frame for implementing, and it gets followed up. And then the relevant national director gets an aggregate report, and if there are systemic issues, they will be highlighted and pulled out in the aggregate report. So in relation to this here, there certainly was a recommendation that went to the national director around the need to prompt the acute hospital system in relation to the implementation of human factors training and SPAR. So
Great,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Cora.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question before we hand over to Cormac. If a site chooses to use another human factors tool, structured communication, is that okay, or does it have to be ISPAR per your audit?
Per our audit, we will audit based on the national guidelines. So really that decision needs to go in, in terms of human factors expertise, informing national guidelines. Now, healthcare audit does have some role around, if there's an issue around the quality of the national guideline, we would have a job to call that out. But I suppose we'd have been satisfied in this circumstance with appropriate human factors expertise informing the development of lines of the associated training.
Right.
Just again, to answer your question, it's not unusual for us to find sites that are doing things different to what's the national guideline, but if it's found to be equivalent, and there's a good evidence base for it, we will comment on it and call it out, and just state it, but they wouldn't necessarily be punished in terms of pulling them down in terms of an assurance level.
Great. Okay, thanks. Cormac.
Here with the microphone. Okay, so I suppose my remit was to give some context in terms of healthcare. I suppose that's quite difficult unless you're maybe living and breathing it. It would be great if we could get everybody in for a Saturday evening in the emergency department, for example, to experience it. But I think in terms of shift handover, you certainly need to take a step backwards. So Cora had kind of introduced that and look at handover more generally. So clinical handover, which is the transfer of patient information and therefore responsibility between persons in the healthcare environment, so professionals usually. And that's very, very broad. So if you think about that transfer of information, plus or minus the responsibility, but certainly information, it's minute by minute, it's happening in hundreds of locations in one hospital at any given time. So it's pretty huge in its pervasiveness and temporality as well. So trying to break it down and think about it in terms of sense making, I suppose, is quite difficult, and it shows the complexity of it. So you could look at it in terms of perspective, so the patient perspective, maybe the professional perspective, the management perspective. You could look at it in terms of location, so ED, and our EDs tend to do this quite well, actually, of all locations, and being the most chaotic at times. Situational, is it a ward round? So it's not based on location, your wards. My ward rounds be 12 ward times, where you go around and see your patients. Theatre is another example there. Professional, so doctor to doctor, nurse to nurse, doctor to nurse, etc. Speciality. So if you think about it in the hospital, you have those facing the patients all the time. Then you have lab, you have radiology, you have all those professions as well, and then time. So when is it happening? So weekend handover is something that we're particularly looking at, or at the shift, so between daytime and nighttime, so in and around 9 o'clock or that period. But listening to the other speakers here, I suppose you could add to that the mode or method as well. So nowadays, face to face versus over the phone versus email. And we're trying to implement different systems in the hospital in terms of task lists as well. So there's all these things as well, but they're overlapping. So how do you put all that together? I don't know the answer to that, but it is difficult. So I think you start by picking out a piece, and that brings us to the next piece here. This is the staff in St. James's there. It's a few years ago. I think I'm in the middle of it. Yeah, we're very efficient and happy. One of them's gone on, drank a lot of coffee and went on to machines. But if you're following the patient journey, so on the right hand side here, you can see the patient comes into the hospital via the emergency department, moves to the wards, maybe the intensive care unit, unfortunately, hopefully coming back out of there. There's different assessment units, there's theatre, there's our scopes list, where people have cameras, look at the valve, look at the lung. There's going for different procedures where just samples taken down to radiology, and they come out the far side as well. So again, the journey is complex, and it's not even being moved from location to location. So at times I'll have a patient who'll come in with a brain injury, that'll be notified to Beaumont. They might wait under my care for 2 days and then they get transferred to Beaumont. Then we have to wait for them to come back, having had whatever they require, 2 or 3 days or a week or 2 weeks later. They may go off somewhere else for radiation, for example, and come back to us. So there are all of these transfers outside the organization, but obviously intrinsic to what we do. And then there's other transfers of care. So somebody who comes in and has been under a different physician in the previous month will be handed back to that doctor, and that'll happen the next morning. So it'll be under my care overnight when I'm on call, and they'll go back to that doctor the next day. So there's handovers of care, or a team with a special expertise in the patient's condition. Maybe once we've got to that condition, say day 3, day 4, they'll take them over. So there's those type of handovers as well. And at the end of that list, then I have that shift handover. So again, it doesn't really follow the patient journey, but of course it's critically important for the patient journey. So that sits at the moment, we're looking particularly at weekends. So we think of St. James's Hospital. St. James's Hospital has 5,000 staff, of which I would guess probably half are patient facing or are certainly involved in the patient care. They have 5,000 more contractors that come in, 10,000 staff, right? So of your medical staff, so your doctors essentially, I would guess probably about 700 or 800, maybe a little bit more. Guess how many of those are there at the weekend. So you take 4 o'clock on a Saturday, how many of those would be there? Any idea? Roughly 5%. Okay, that is 45-ish. Anybody else? Probably 10 to 15 on a Saturday at 4 o'clock are in the building. That's what's looking after. Now, of course, you don't have the clinics, you don't have the procedural lists, but that's what's happening. So it's critical that shift handover is working during that period. So maybe this is a better representation of where we're at St. James's. So trying to make sense of that in terms of the human factors, really it's about the variation. Variation is the enemy of quality, as those who've taught me in quality improvements repeat again and again. And it's trying to reduce that variation, which I think is what our other speakers really spoke to in their circumstances. And to try and look at that in terms of human factors, there's the job there. So I don't remember seeing clinical handover on any job description that I've seen. I don't think it's on my contract. I'm not sure it would make a difference if it is, but if it's supposed to be part of the job and it's a really, really critical part of the job, it likely should be there. There isn't training around it. And I put a caveat in that, is that we do loads and loads of training. Like you've so many things to try and update all the time. I'm not sure that's the ideal answer either. There's likely tools there, and with tools comes the implementation and the training. There's all of that. But there's certainly things that we need to do. And then the task part of it, so it means different things to different people. And then there's the individual, you know yourself, you walk into somebody's house and it's pristine and everything's organized, you walk into somebody else and it's chaos, everybody running around and those people bring that organizational background and skills, and they would have maybe grown up in that environment into a healthcare environment. And you will find that a lot of people will drift towards what suits them. So in ED, for example, we know people who have more difficulty with organizations tend to drift towards ED, and they're able to cope with that environment. Maybe it's a better way of terming it. And then there's the organization, so there's resources. So while we're looking at handover at the weekend with that number of staff, how do you manage a hospital? How do you take half an hour out when there's a sick patient in the resuscitation room that needs to be seen right now? How do you ensure that all of those doctors meet at a certain time and down tools? It's very, very difficult. There's the procedures around that. How does that, with Cora's work and what she does and some of those guidances, how actually they work on the ground. But I think most importantly, there's the culture and the leadership. That's really, really critical to it all. We are trying, but it is a challenge to say the least. So I hope that gives some kind of background to it. But I think reading and smelling is different than seeing it here. But anyway, that's a little sample.
Thanks. Thank you. So give a round of applause for Laurence. And then I suppose we have, a couple of questions that, Chiara and I had wanted to ask on behalf of the Irish Human Factors Society. There's some questions coming in online, and then there's obviously, anybody here that wants to ask any questions. I suppose our first one is around human factors, and it's linked with the questions online. People are asking, well, what parts of, I suppose, what's the most important thing in handover in terms of human factors? And then do we have training? Do each of your industries actually have targeted training in terms of training people to do really good handover? So human factors training for handover. That's the first question. So anybody can take it first.
Well, okay, I'll take it from we do a lot of training, we do a lot of exercises, and certainly the incident command system that we use lends itself well for enabling everybody to know where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing. Where I think it falls down is that capturing of the information, because when things are moving so fast, and it's very, very easy to forget, and then human factors being what they are, that people generate memories that didn't really occur because that's what somebody else said. So it's a big challenge, and it's so easy then for someone to critique decision-making process after the event when they have the beauty and time to analyze and say, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? That's the big challenge. So training, experience is probably the best thing. You need to have the structure, you need to have the consistency of approach, and then that born out in experience, and that's where you get the higher standards achieved, I think. That helps you answer your question.
Yes, thank you. Okay, would you?
Yeah, I suppose I think one of the most important things about shift handover in our context is making sure that it's appropriate, and that it's kind of like I heard once about the way the brain works and how it remembers and forgets. We remember where we parked our bike today, but the brain knows to just forget that in 2 weeks' time, but not to forget something else important that you maybe learned, or maybe where you put that 50 quid, that emergency money somewhere. And that's what you need to do at a shift handover. That we have people who were on shift yesterday, so you need to give them, and they're coming in this morning after being in yesterday, they're going to need one type of handover. They'll have a fairly good idea nearly when they walk in the gate what's happening, because they can nearly guess. They've only been away for 8 hours, 12 hours, whatever. But the person who's handing over needs to kind of assess, well, the next guy who's coming in hasn't been here for 3 days because they've had their 2 days off, or maybe they've been away for 3 weeks and they're not going to just need to know what happened over the last few hours. They're going to need to know that we made several major changes to the plant last week and we did something else 10 days ago. And do I even, as the guy who's handing over, know all the stuff that happened? Was it even handed over to me so that I can hand it over to the next guy? So it's I suppose it's making sure that as humans we consider each other, and that we know that we're giving an appropriate handover, and that we're filtering out all of the stuff that the person doesn't need, which sounds easy, and that's usually actually not that difficult, but it's remembering the stuff that we do need to convey to the person, which maybe has been in existence at the plant for a week and everyone knows it now, except the guy who's been away for 10 days, you know.
And there was a question in the chat for you, Aidan, actually. How long does ESP allocate to shift and over in terms of time?
It varies by location. Some of our locations are more complex. It's probably 15 minutes to a half an hour. Often it's longer. If we are in, for instance, on a scheduled overhaul, people will come in for an hour because usually there's so much going on. The person who's coming on knows that they will need an hour to go through everything. But for the most part, it's about 15 minutes to a half an hour under, you know, that's, you know, that'll be for a few weeks a year, that hour-long handover. Most of the time it's 15 minutes to a half an hour.
Thanks, Aidan. Cora and Cormac, there's a difficult question here in terms of healthcare. So you may not be able to answer it, but there could be people online who are able to answer it, because the NCC guideline recommends human factors training for shift handover. So there's a question, is there a validated training available, the human factors training support resource for people to actually, you know, to use?
Well, I'd certainly like to hear what the experts online say. What I can say from the point of view of the audit that we did, you're right, the guidelines do say that the training needs to include human factors. Our audit found that, you know, human factors training aside, pure training and clinical handover wasn't even necessarily a thing. It was only one of the 6 sites that had a human factors session, and there was a small amount of attendance at that, and it was broader than clinical handover anyway. So I suppose if you're talking about training people how to use ISPAR, that's kind of a piece of human factors. It's using human factors tool. So I can say that while none of the hospitals provided specific training in clinical handover, there were a range of mandatory and non-mandatory training programs that included elements of clinical handover and addressed leadership, effective communication and teamwork, which as human factors experts we know is really important, and attendance at these ranged from 13% to 100%. So as I say, only one site had a human factors training session, but it wasn't about clinical handover. It was human factors in healthcare. So that's what we found. So yes, if someone wants to, and certainly our recommendation did say that, you know, there needs to be more training at some sites. Some sites had fantastic training records. There was a tendency for nurse training records to show better attendance than medical and allied health professionals. But at the 4 sites that achieved a high assurance level, they had good attendance level of all disciplines. So the recommendation was that where training was less satisfactory, they needed to introduce it or improve it, and they needed to include human factors. So the guideline doesn't say validated human factors training, it says human factors training.
Okay.
But I'd love to hear what, I'm sorry, Cormac.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to.
So I think there's probably particular nuances to that, which are particular to healthcare, maybe not, but we have more than one master. So you have your employer and your paymaster, but you also have your training master. So we have our colleges that train us. And so human factors is part of training in the Royal College of Surgeons, for example, not in College of Physicians as far as I know, but I could be wrong, or maybe it's been brought in since I was training. So you do that, and sometimes you see overlap between, you know, what's done in the colleges, what's done in the employer, and that can cause quite a lot of frustration. But in terms of human factors then on site, you know, I'm not aware of it. And I think if you call it human factors training, people will attend. Calling it clinical handover training, people won't attend. You need to, you know, I think there is something to draw people in to say, okay, trying to make sense of their environment towards handover as a term is a bit more mundane. People are less like hand washing. Very difficult to get people to do that training.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll open up to the floor now, to the room or to people online, if you have any questions. And please, for anybody online, just feel free to put your hand up and you can come on. Exactly. So Margaret, we'll go to you first. If you want to unmute, Margaret, and just ask the question yourself.
Yeah, hello everybody, and thank you very much for all the input so far. Yeah, so I work in the National Quality and Patient Safety Directorate, and human factors is something that we're looking at specifically at the moment. I suppose I'm a nurse by background, so a lot of the training pieces that you've talked about, in communication, ISPAR, the mandatory training pieces that already exist are there. But targeted human factors training for clinical handover is something that we're only starting to look at. We've identified that as a gap in the training portfolio. We haven't looked at it specifically, and it's something that we're collaborating with many of the people in the room now to start looking at it in specifically.
Great, thanks, Margaret. Thank you.
Can we maybe also remind everyone that has also experience and to share, because the issue with the factors and shift and over in general, also shift and over in terms of in safety critical task, is that accident data part, because communication was missed, because important pieces of information when failed to be transferred from one shift to the next. So the clean process industry, as far as I know, I know less, but I'm sure it's the case. I have anecdotal evidence of that happening in healthcare for personal reasons. But there's also an important factor that this information is collected and evaluated, so that the part of the root causes of events that might have happened are related to poor shifting over, poor transfer of communication, poor monitoring of day-to-day operational data that is useful. And the quality depends on the data now as well. Yeah, on the audience, anyone?
So just our second part, are there any questions? Yes, Victor.
Yeah, just to follow on
Wow.
No, we don't deter people from.
They can hear us from here, so if you speak louder, they can do it.
a question to Cormac and Cora. Excellent presentation. My question was, I heard you saying that a junior doctor did hand over a piece of information to the senior doctor in the Panava case.
Yes.
Do you get a sense from your work of what type of information, some sort of empirical number about how many bits of information from your previous system didn't get handed over, but as a result of your intervention has improved? Do you have that type of number or description?
Not as empirical of that as that, but certainly it's not just then about shift handover and the community. So certainly SBAR would have helped. That bit about identity situation, background assessment, and recommendation, you would hope would have meant that more complete information was checked and returned, and that there was a clarity that both people were on the same hymn sheet in terms of communication of information. But in terms of having, all the parameters communicated, early warning score is another aspect of that. So that's another tool, but we're not talking about that today. And in 5 minutes, I didn't have time to talk about it, but that was another aspect of the solution to that problem. So nothing empirical in terms of, talking about that, all of those numbers, but certainly there are audits of the implementation of early warning scores, the amount of time that it's correct, the amount of time that there are mistakes. But and there are really good local clinical audits being done. And from our point of view, when we would do an audit, we randomly select sites and then randomly select charts, and it might only be 20 charts per site, which will not be a representative sample of the population of people whose early warning scores need to be looked at, but certainly will be enough for us to give a picture of whether there are or aren't, whether things are okay, or there are systemic issues that are coming from 6 or 7 sites that need to be addressed from a national level. So I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, or if it's enough of an answer. But I suppose our data is getting better all the time. Our information is getting better all the time. Sorry.
So just one of the reasons we had today was seeing if we could learn from each other and learn across sectors. So I'm just wondering, the presentation, they are so different. I think you have each highlighted totally different contexts
And systems.
and challenges and numbers. And so do you think we can learn from each other?
Can I just say something to break the ice here? I think, as I said, in aviation, for instance, and in ESB, the transformation towards a digital shift and over was happening around the same time, 6 years. We're talking about 6 years. So it's not a long time. And the bits that is still missing is using that information, analyzing the information you get from the shift and over, not just for searching, which is what, it's a useful thing. It's searching and tracking and effectively being able to report on things that are being done, monitoring the things that are being done in a more effective way, less time consuming way, etc. And traceability, but also making sense of what value is embedded into that data that we can extract and use. That is still missing. We still have to do that. That has to be done still, it's not there. So,
I think maybe just to add to that, it's a looking backward answer to your question, but I suppose what we were talking about here today in terms of clinical handover between shifts, between departments, between multidisciplinary teams, patients are deteriorating. The tools that we're using there came from other domains. Healthcare has already learned, and I believe will always continue to need to learn from other domains. So they were definitely human factor solutions that we brought in from other reliability domains.
I would suggest then also from a learning is the consistency of approach. Like you can see that in all the domains that are here, that it's the consistency in the approach and the extrapolation of the information from a consistent approach, structured approach that gives consistent results. And that guide, it gives the confidence of the people who are utilizing the tools that what they are doing, is right, and takes that sort of edgy sort of uncertainty away, when difficult decisions have to be made.
I'd agree there. Yeah, I think consistency is very important for us as well. And while we all work in different sectors, I can definitely recognize some of the things like the stress that sometimes exists at a shift changeover. It's probably not quite as extreme as it would be in the when you're attending a fire or in the health service where lives are at risk. But there can be very stressful times where multiple people are in a room all doing individual shift changeovers. The team leaders will be doing theirs and other people are talking over there, all needing to talk and hand over information. And there's a lot of stuff going on, and maybe the machine is coming off and the lights may go out potentially, or there could be certainly a lot of extra hassle and work for people. So they're kind of saying, I need to do this quickly. I need to get in and out of here in 2 minutes. And really, sometimes you have to make that decision. Do I say, no, hold on a sec here? Whatever about the machine tripping, even whatever about the lights coming off, there's a couple of safety things here that just we need to spend the 10 minutes at. Otherwise, there will be, worse consequences. And it's quite difficult to make sure that happens and that it happens consistently, even no matter what the situation, what the environment,
Agree with that,
yeah, the circumstances.
I'll give you an example of that. Like, we were able to fire situation, and it's going one end to the other, fully developed fire, something like that. If you don't take the time to put your ducks in a row and do your consistent approach, then it's too late because the things move too fast. And equally in the healthcare sphere, a patient can change so fast that what's going on with them can change so fast that if you haven't got all the bits and pieces, you can't play catch up. It's too late to play catch up when you hit the sort of catastrophic disastrous levels.
I suppose just from, you've heard Cormac and Cora there, where say Cormac's on duty and he might have to hand over 30 patients. Do you think it's possible to use, to these kind of fixed tools, techniques like ISBAR? If you were to go through ISBAR for every patient, for 30 patients, that would take Cormac a couple of hours, maybe?
Well, we know that there's a handover between ED and our medical registrars, for example, and on a night, they could have 20, for example, handed over, and it's between 5 and 10 per patient. So they're on a 12-hour shift and maybe have 10 of that to clear up their patients and get them through the help of the SHOs. They can spend 2 hours with that just on the handover piece. And that's an ad hoc, so it's as the patients come in. Aside from then, what we're trying to work on is having a handover at the start of their shift as well. The person who's done their job for the previous 12 hours, and unfortunately that 12 hours has been split to a 4-hour and a 8-hour shift. So now there's 3, you know, so these things are complex. But I think looking at what the other presenters have shown us is some of the tools that can be used, and maybe trying to pick a scenario, and I suppose that has been done relatively well in terms of the early warning. You know, so there's a good example there, and our emergency departments tend to do it very well. So they all stop for a period of time, bar maybe 1 or 2, and they hand over at 5 o'clock, for example, on a given day. And that tends to work quite well in the emergency departments that I've worked in anyway. So they do that quite well. The same thing in the morning at 8. So there's certainly good examples there that we just need to build on bit by bit.
And Cora, could you tell us what, from your audit, what was the difference between the maternity units and the acute?
Yes, I suppose just to say, you know, in the maternity sites, it was being done very well. So that bit about 30 to be handed over was being done very well, and good evidence of it. The difference were one of the acute sites had a local guideline that wasn't aligned to the national guidelines. So that was, do you remember I said there's the governance piece, the risk management piece, the audit, and then the operations, checking a healthcare record to see the evidence of, and observing. Actually, for the maternity services, our auditors didn't observe because it was at the time of COVID when we had to have a light touch in terms of presence, but for the acute, it was a little bit later. So they actually observed the clinical handover as well, so they could pick up the verbal elements of the handover as well. So for the other, they were looking at the evidence in healthcare records only. So in the acute sites, number one, there was one site that didn't have PPGs that were aligned with national audit. 2, they had, you know, the records were lower in terms of attendance at training, less evidence of local audit. And one of the sites actually had a practice of recording one of the shift handovers. Now, a recording handover would have been in complete contravention of, because from a human factors point of view, when you're listening to a recording, you know, when you're talking to someone, you've got body language, you've got an opportunity that if you haven't heard, say what, sorry, say that again. In a recording, the recording could be lost, recording could be damaged, you mightn't hear the bit. Now, there were no incidents arising because one of the things the audit did was looked at incidents reporting, because that's part of the governance structure, and evidence of sharing of learning related to incidents arising from clinical handover incidents. Nevertheless, that would have been a very immediate recommendation needing a very immediate action. So those are the reasons why. Yeah.
So we probably have time for one last question. Suzanne, or okay, to Nick and Suzanne, you're online there. Do you want to just ask your question yourself? You have your hand up there. Susan, sorry. Susan Keane?
We can't hear you though. You have to unmute yourself. I'm muted.
You can do it. No, she's down here. No, it's not her. Suzanne Keane. It's not her.
Sorry.
Let me see if I can unmute.
Yeah.
Oh.
I can only ask her to unmute. Great, working now.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I suppose Susan Keane is my name. I work in QPS and IEHG, and at the moment we are completing site visits. Just in relation, I suppose, the National Patient Safety Strategy and commitment for the reducing the common forms of harm, and obviously the deterioration patient. So we're going around to the sites and we're looking at the structures and processes that are in place around deterioration patient, and we're using the national clinical guidelines, the recommendations in that to kind of, I suppose, generate some ideas of where the sites stand. But the common theme that we seem to come across is that there's some really good areas of practice in relation to clinical handover, huddles, pause, safety pause in all the sites. But I think the education and training piece seems to be a common theme for all of them, in that there is maybe lack of awareness in relation to where they can access the structured training around human factors and also around communication. So there's a lot of effort going into it, but just maybe that piece maybe should be considered maybe a little bit more.
Great, yeah, absolutely, Susan. Yeah, and I think that's what Margaret was speaking to earlier, that they are working on in the National Quality and Patient Safety Office, they are working on developing training.
Yeah, that would be really, really useful, I think.
Great. I think we're all in agreement. Absolutely, yeah. Nick, last question for you, Nick.
No.
Louder, very.
It's very quiet.
Very quickly, I mean, you're adding more information into the system, you're adding data, particularly if you're using a tool, right, essentially. So that goes into the wider data picture in a sense. So you're talking not just about the relationship between one person and another, or one team and another, in a sense. You're actually contributing to the potential knowledge base within the organization. Perhaps overwhelming it with too much information, in a sense. How do you see managing that issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. Somebody once in ESB described, like when you bring it in a new system, it's like buying a beast. You know, the problem is once you buy a beast, you have to feed it and you have to keep feeding it. And then you need to filter out stuff that will then come back and overload you in terms of, we call it alarm flooding, where you get hundreds of alarms and really the vast majority of them are not needed. We went through a program, the alarm management program, as part of Brian McLear's project in ESB. You know, I suppose what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is it takes work and persistence, and you have to make it somebody's job to go after and clean up all of that stuff on an ongoing basis. I think a lot of organizations, including ourselves, fall into the trap of believing that's just a project, and that was a project, but when it finished being a project, then somebody had to continue doing it. So now every month there is a system which gathers together the number of alarm messages that are coming into the operators and says, look, are we doing anything about this? It's probably, a lot of them are nuisance alarms. You probably need to change parameters to stop them coming in. And it's the same with the shift handover stuff. You know, we have recurring messages in there to remind people for the next 2 months this is going to happen. Of course, at the end of 2 months, actually it's going to go on for another 6 weeks now. But then somebody has to come along and filter that out. It has to be somebody's job, and it isn't easy. It's not the sort of work that people tend to love doing, you know. But it's essential. Otherwise, the system will collapse because it will fall away because there's just too much garbage on it, you know, and you can't see, you know, the wood for the trees.
I'd agree with you there to a great extent. The more data you capture, then how do you utilize it effectively? So it's about prioritization and categorization. So from my perspective, as gathering all the information at a fire, is a huge amount of information to be gathered, and some of it will be relevant, some of it will be important, and some will not. And this is where it feeds into then the extrapolation of that information. So that would come in the form of the fire report, what we call the fire report. So it takes the salient information, the ones that's important, who's going to use that information, who's that information for. So from our perspective, it'll be the homeowner, it'll be the business owner, it'll be the insurance company in particular, and they want to know, you know, the information that's relevant to them. Equally, each stakeholder will want the information that relates to them. So you have to have it as clean as you can, and to whilst further down the road from a data analysis perspective, some of the information may be useful, but is extrapolating what's relevant to the relevant stakeholder for them and categorizing it appropriately and prioritizing it then as well. So that takes work. There's no two ways about it. You will have to have extra, but the reward far outweighs the workload that's associated with it, I would suggest.
I suppose you have the amount of data that's handed over for the patient and the incident, but then you have maybe the metadata or looking at, you know, the shifts and how many patients and how many people were there and how often it happened and how long it took. which is probably more informative for the projects that we're looking at. And you know, needing the resource then to track that. I suppose when our handover at the weekend, we're looking maybe say at 9 o'clock on a Saturday. So who are we going to get to keep those records? We do have electronic patient record, which can do so much, but it's for, you know, patient information, which this sits outside. And therefore, is there a separate system that we can do this on, and how will we track it? So, you know, even if we bring in a tool, where does that sit? So there's a lot in terms of the implementation, but having the data is key for any improvement. So we'll have to work our way through it. It's a good point.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thanks, everybody. We bring it to a close.
Thanks for the people connected remotely as well. I hope you could hear us okay. I know that it's never easy to manage a hybrid format, and we did our best here.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us,
Yeah.
and we'll make the recording available on the member area.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much. Thanks for speakers again.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Can I have some lunch now, please?
Yes.
Please.
Sounds good. Sounds good indeed. An appetite.
Great.